Hi everyone, it's Paige. Today I will be presenting on Atonement Part 2, Chapters 4 through 6. Let's begin with a recap of what happened during these chapters. Chapter 4 begins with Robbie, now known as Turner, walking to Dunkirk. He imagines life after the war and a reunion with Cecilia. He imagines being cleared of his criminal record, but then notes that Bryony would always be in the way. Finally, and most importantly, Robbie has a theory of Bryony's motives behind falsely accusing him. Many summers ago, Robbie was teaching Bryony how to swim. During this lesson, Bryony jumped into the current for the sole purpose that Robbie would save her. After saving her, he tells her that that was a stupid idea and that she could have drowned. She then confesses her love for Robbie. Robbie's theory is that Bryony might have accused him because he betrayed her love by favoring her sister Cecilia. Chapter 5 begins with Robbie and many other soldiers walking towards a French column. He notices that civilians are continuing to live their normal lives. Suddenly, there is an attack from above, and everyone is running for cover. Robbie tries to help a woman and her son at this time, but she is in shock and won't move, so Robbie ends up running away to save his own life. He takes cover in the woods. Here it is mentioned that Corporal Nettle shared an ammo bar with the other troops. I think this is foreshadowing the reappearance of Paul Marshall later on in the book. While continuing on the walk to Dunkirk, Robbie has vague memories of his father, and he hopes to reconnect with him after the war. As Robbie, Corporal Nettle, and Corporal Mace approach a sergeant at a bridge, Nettle instructs Robbie to fake an injury so that he won't be chosen for perimeter defense duties. Robbie pretends to limp and is able to pass to avoid these duties. The chapter ends with Nettle flinging off his boots, but Robbie persuading him to put them back on as they continue on their trek to Dunkirk. In Chapter 6, they finally make it to Dunkirk. Robbie, Corporal Nettle, and Corporal Mace are all extremely thirsty and walk into a bar with hopes of finding water. In the bar, the three of them end up intervening in an attack on a raft man to most likely save his life. Following this, in their search for water, Robbie and Nettle approach what they call a gypsy, who said that she would give them water in exchange for capturing her pig. After they capture the pig, she gives them lots of water, food, and even wine. Next, they search for a place to rest. After finding a place, Robbie begins to enter this somewhat confused, half-asleep phase where he urges to go back to bury the boy who died in the beginning of Part 2. He ends up yelling, "No," in his sleep, and Nettle helps quiet him down. Nettle reveals that the Navy is waiting outside to take them home in the morning. So that's pretty much everything that went down in this section. For my close reading, I chose a passage beginning at the bottom of page 227 and ending on page 228. In this passage, Robbie reflects on the thoughts and desires of him and the other men as they walk to Dunkirk. So just for some context, this takes place in Chapter 5, just after the attack in which Robbie is unable to save the woman and her son. During this scene, Robbie and the other soldiers are making their way to Dunkirk. Right after this, Robbie fakes the injury to avoid being chosen for perimeter defense duty. I will read you the passage now. All around him, men were walking silently with their thoughts, reforming their lives, making resolutions. If I ever get out of this lot. They could never be counted, the dreamed-up children, mentally conceived on the walk into Dunkirk, and later made flesh. He would find Cecilia. Her address was on the letter in his pocket, next to the poem. In the deserts of the heart, let healing fountains start. He would find his father, too. They were supposed to be good at tracking down missing persons. The Salvation Army. A perfect name. He would track down his father or his dead father's story. Either way, he would become his father's son. I thought this passage was really important because it takes us into the mindset of not just Robbie, but the other soldiers during their time in war. McEwen writes that the men walked silently in their thoughts. I interpreted this as indicating deep sorrow and reflection amongst the soldiers. I thought this was the case since they were not really talking to each other at the time, but were simply alone in their thoughts. While Robbie thinks of Cecilia and his father, the other men each have their own lives and stories that they want to get back to. This passage shows hope amongst Robbie and the soldiers as they dream about life after the war and even the possibility of having children. Prior to this passage, Robbie attempts to remember his father, but is left with very few memories. He wonders if his father served in the Great War, like many of the other soldiers' fathers. He longs for a father, and longs to become a father one day. I found it interesting that Robbie was thinking about his father during this time, as he was only briefly mentioned in the beginning of the novel. This passage shows how many of the men had thoughts of reforming their lives and making resolutions. So I think Robbie's relationship with his father is one of the aspects in his life that he would like to reform. I also think this was meant to show his hopes and dreams for life after the war. Overall, I thought this passage was interesting because it provides us with insight into what many of the soldiers were going through. Finally, here are some discussion questions I have for you guys. Number 1. In part 2, Robbie continues to remember Cecilia's words, "I'll wait for you, come back," to keep moving forward to survive. Without this, do you think Robbie would have survived all the way to this point? Number 2. How do you think the absence of Robbie's father has affected him? If his father were present, how would the story have been different? Number 3. Despite Corporal Mace and Corporal Nettle being of higher rank than Robbie, why do you think they chose to follow him? Number 4. On page 225, it is mentioned that Nettle has an ammo bar that they all pass around to share. These are the same ammo bars that Paul Marshall manufactures. What do you think this foreshadows? And finally, number 5. Discuss Robbie's mental state at the end of chapter 6.